Pretty much for as long as humanity has existed, every generation has had its own form of rebellion, its own style, voice, and way of standing out against the mainstream. Looking back, subcultures have always been at the forefront of change, dominating in times of chaos and uncertainty. And judging by today's political climate, new countercultures under the influence of Gen Z must be just around the corner, right? So, what does it mean for us? Are we on the verge of a new cultural revolution, as many TikTok users would have you believe? Or has the digital age actually made it impossible for new subcultures to form and thrive? That's what we're going to discuss today. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to get into today's topic because subcultures have kind of been a hyperfixation of mine for a few years now, and given the current state of the world, I think they're actually more relevant than ever before. We're going to take a look at why they matter, their history, and whether or not Gen Z is capable of creating new countercultures. Also, quick disclaimer, this is going to be a bit of a long one, but I had a lot of fun researching and I hope it's going to be interesting. So, yeah, grab a snack or a drink and let's get into it. Once we're going to get into a few examples throughout history, you're going to see that subcultures are way more than just an aesthetic movement. They're an act of rebellion, really. When the world feels broken, they're how people, especially young people, find their voices. So let's start with the basics. What even is a subculture? By definition, it's a group within society that rejects, critiques, or redefines the mainstream through their style and fashion and music and their values. Essentially, it's a mix of rebellion, self expression, and community. But obviously, subcultures don't just happen out of nowhere. They're the result of a larger crisis at hand. When politics, economics, and social norms push people to their breaking point. But why is it always the youth leading the change? According to Pew Research Center, over 70% of social and cultural movements have historically been spearheaded by people under 30. A possible explanation could be that younger people are simply more likely to question authority and are more hopeful for the world to change. They're not yet fully entrenched in the system, so when the first cracks start to show, they're going to be the ones saying, well, wait, this actually isn't working for us, and maybe we need to change something about it. And right now, especially, I think it's really important to be on the lookout for potential youth cultures because, as we're going to see later on, they've managed to change the world before. Civil rights movements, environmentalism, and even major music genres, from jazz to punk, have roots in different youth cultures. In a way, they're both a reflection of their time and also a look into the future. Before we truly dive into this section of the video, I want to put out a quick disclaimer. I know this is going to be a super long one, considering we're going to take a look at 5 separate subcultures that shaped the 20th century. You're obviously free to skip any group. The timestamps are going to be in the description below. But I felt it was important to include examples from different countries and not just solely focus on the US. Where this is still a mostly Western approach to the topic, it highlights the diversity of different youth culture movements throughout history, or at least I hope it does. I mean, each of these countercultures formed under really unique political and historical conditions, and in a way created their own mini revolution to challenge them. Now, let's get into the first one. We're starting out in the 1920s. World War One is finally over, and the US is thriving economically. However, as glamorous as the Roaring Twenties might seem on the surface, beneath it all, a women led shift was happening. As their brothers and fathers were fighting overseas, young women who came of age during the wartime took over jobs which prior to that were only reserved for men. Experiencing their first sense of independence, these same women obviously weren't ready to just give their freedom up again once the war was over and the men returned demanding for their jobs back. Even though women gained the right to vote in 1920, women were still expected to marry young, dress conservatively, and stay in domestic spheres. Flappers rejected all of that. It was here that, particularly for women, self fulfillment and independence became priorities. Flappers reinvented themselves by adopting a carefree spirit, which the older generation wasn't too happy about because they deemed it as wild and disgraceful. And yeah, also quick disclaimer, we're going to see a pattern of conflict between younger and older generations pretty much all throughout this section of the video. And this might also be a good time to mention the prohibition period of the time. I'm pretty sure by now it's just common knowledge, either through history class or The Great Gatsby. But as a response to pre existing social issues like domestic violence, the US government decided to ban alcohol. However, it wasn't completely impossible to drink back then because speakeasies, which were essentially bars and clubs that operated illegally in the 1920s, served alcohol pretty much all over the country. In their essence, flappers were all about liberation. They smoked, they drank, and they danced wildly to jazz music, challenging social norms at every turn. Arguably, though, what these women are most remembered for today is probably the way they chose to dress, as the sheer amount of Great Gatsby themed parties and poorly executed Halloween costumes will show you. To achieve their distinct look, flappers bobbed their hair, wore knee length dresses, which, considering the time, was definitely a scandal, and embraced androgyny. Bold makeup drew attention to their faces, and sleeveless, beaded dresses complemented their bodies when they danced the Charleston. But this definitely wasn't just about the fashion or aesthetic of it all. In a way, it was defiance, because this counterculture of women rejected the curvy and corseted Gibson girl look at the time, which was the standard of their mothers, and instead embraced a freedom of movement and expression. I think Zelda Fitzgerald, who was a member of the counterculture herself, described the flapper lifestyle best in Eulogy of a Flapper from 1922. She says, "The flapper awoke from her lethargy of subdasm, bobbed her hair, put on her choicest pair of earrings and a great deal of audacity and rouge, and went into the battle. She flirted because it was fun to flirt, and wore a one-piece bathing suit because she had a good figure. She covered her face with powder and paint because she didn't need it, and she refused to be bored, chiefly because she wasn't boring. She was conscious that the things she did were the things she always wanted to do. Mothers disapproved of their sons taking the flappers to dances, to tease, to swim, and most of all to hoard. She had mostly masculine friends, but youth does not need friends, it needs only crowds." And if the flappers were about joy and freedom, the swing youth, or in German Swingjugend, was about mere survival. In Nazi Germany, the act of rebellion was pretty much a death sentence, which makes the actions of this counterculture to defy the regime even more remarkable. Under Hitler's totalitarian rule, the younger generation was forced into the Hitlerjugend and the Bund der Deutschen Mädel, where boys trained for war and girls were basically groomed for motherhood. But not everyone complied. The Swingjugend was a group of mostly middle class teens from big cities like Hamburg and Berlin that found refuge in American swing and jazz music, which the Nazis deemed as degenerate. Members of the counterculture shared a love for individual freedom. They attended extravagant parties and welcomed both men and women to join their lifestyle. Under a regime that put a huge emphasis on separating boys and girls from a very young age, this vague notion of gender equality wasn't really welcome per se. The swing youth was fascinated with the American and British culture that ranged basically from fashion to music and even language. Men wore trench coats, hats, ties, and umbrellas, and also kept their hair long. Women went for short skirts and wore makeup, which were all in pretty stark contrast to the Nazi ideal, which was all about simplicity and uniformity. They began using Anglicisms when speaking with each other and even adopted English names for themselves. Amongst the most popular ones were Teddy, Bobby, and Dolly. As the political climate worsened, they continued to mock Nazi ideology through parody, risking arrest and even persecution. This was in no way a harmless rebellion. Many of the members were arrested and later on, unfortunately, lost their lives in concentration camps. Their story shows how subculture can be an act of resistance, even when it comes to the matter of life and death. Following the horrors of the Second World War, 1960s Britain was focused on rebuilding itself. And in it, the generation born in its aftermath, the baby boomers, became of age. Ironically, these days, boomer has become kind of synonymous with traditional views and conservative attitudes. But in the 60s, they were the rebellious youth pushing against the traditional values of their parents' generation. It's actually kind of funny because looking back, I think they were one of the most radical and culture shifting generations in modern history, as we're going to see with the mods that formed out of it in London. Due to the economic fallout of the war, the country relied on food rationing, which lingered well into the 1950s. By the early 60s, however, a lot of working class youth had disposable income for the first time ever and essentially made even more money than their parents. On top of that, they gained access to consumer goods. This meant that suddenly the younger generation was able to invent identities which weren't just about survival, but about prioritizing pleasure, change, and individualism by idolizing sophistication and modernity. Mods wanted to stand out and in the process created fashion trends, which essentially shaped the way we dress even today. On top of it all, a sexual revolution was happening at the time because, thanks to the introduction of birth control, a new kind of freedom and empowerment unfolded, especially for young women at the time. This shift was felt not only in rebellious behavior but also in the way that mods dressed and the music they listened to. British rock bands such as The Kinks, The Who, and The Beatles were incredibly popular amongst mods. Looking back, mods were pretty much at the forefront of Britain's fashion revolution at the time. They gravitated towards the more polished European look and kind of combined it with working class practicality. Boys wore slim fitted suits, which were covered up with a parka when riding the Italian Vespa, which pretty much became the staple of the counterculture. Girls adopted clean lines either in matching tops and skirts or in fitted dresses that didn't even reach the knee because the sexual revolution made room for yet another scandalous invention at the time, which was the miniskirt. Safe to say, their parents' generation wasn't too keen on these changes, deeming it as disrespectful. That notion was further supported by the fact that members of the subculture seemed to be living for the weekend only, partying all night and taking amphetamines to keep up the energy. As the years went on, the movement evolved and paved the way for the broader swinging London scene of the 1960s, where the mod's ethos of individuality and style basically exploded into a global phenomenon of color, creativity, and just cultural reinvention. While mods leaned into style and speed, The hippies overseas in the US went in the opposite direction, rejecting modernity, embracing nature, and dreaming of a utopian future. The majority of them were free spirited, upper middle class students from liberal colleges such as Berkeley and San Francisco State University, with San Francisco pretty much becoming the epicenter of the hippie movement in the 60s. Aside from their style and drug use, today the counterculture is probably best known for their political activism and peaceful mass protests, which resulted from a turbulent time of 1960s America. The Vietnam War, the assassination of key figures such as JFK and Martin Luther King Jr., and the fight for civil rights created a disillusionment with authority. For the hippies, this era gave them ground to challenge societal norms and imagine a world that values peace and love over profit and violence. They rejected materialism and embraced environmentalism before it became mainstream. Many turned to Eastern philosophies, psychedelic experiences, and alternative spiritualities to explore the boundaries of consciousness and self exploration. As with every subculture, the aesthetic of the hippies evolved a lot from its early beginnings up until its shift into the mainstream in the 1970s. Around the height of flower power, which was probably around like 1968, distinct trends amongst members included flared jeans, psychedelic patterns, and fringed jackets. Accessories like headbands, beaded necklaces, and peace symbol pendants added to their free spirited vibe, and their long hair became an act of rebellion against the conservative, clean cut ideal of the 1950s and early 60s. Music was really at the heart of the movement, with artists such as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and George Harrison sort of being a part of the subculture themselves. Their lyrics often echoed anti-war sentiments, the promise of change, and a search for a higher being, which was also fueled by the use of LSD and other psychedelics at the time. The influence of drugs also resulted in the creation of a lot of really experimental albums, such as the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and furthermore brought together a lot of different genres from rock to folk. And on top of that, music festivals like Woodstock in 1969 became a cultural phenomenon and are likely, or at least in my opinion, really a major influence to why today music festivals have become so popular. Ultimately, hippies were probably just as much about breaking societal rules as they were about creating their own way of life, which is why communes became so popular amongst them. They were a way to escape the pressures of capitalism and an embrace of non monogamous relationships. However, older generations couldn't really understand their rejection of traditional values, or rather, didn't want to. A tale as old as time at this point. They saw them as dirty, drug addicted college dropouts with dangerously radical politics, which obviously wasn't helped by their open use of cannabis and psychedelics. Unfortunately, the sun is like really, really blinding and I can barely see, but I think it's gonna be gone in a second, hopefully. Yeah. By the mid 70s, many members grew older and re entered into mainstream society, while the counterculture's aesthetic and ideals kind of shifted into the broader culture. However, besides the already mentioned music festivals, their influence can still be felt in our current society, from environmentalism to LGBTQ plus rights and the ongoing push for equality. In a way, their ideals paved the way for current movements and shaped our awareness for justice. Okay, I know it's been a really long one. In fact, it took me 2 days to film this video. Um, because unfortunately the sun wasn't on my side, as you can see right now as well. But we finally made it to the very last one of our 5 examples, and this one's a proper rebellion for sure. Vivienne Westwood, who you probably know from staples such as her iconic pearl choker and her insane corsets, was really a driving force behind the punk aesthetic in the UK. She once famously said, "Punk was a way of seeing if one could put a spoke in the system," which, as we get into, they surely did. In Britain, punk emerged during a time of rampant unemployment and class division. Young people felt angry and abandoned by a system which basically offered them no future whatsoever. This dissatisfaction was channeled into punk, which rejected both the polished consumerism of the 1960s, which stemmed from the mods, if you remember, and the political values of the 1970s. Therefore, punk was inherently political. It was about the belief that society needed to be torn down in order to create something new. For punks, DIY became a common practice of the movement. They personalized their clothes using safety pins, patches, and spikes. Plaid trousers, leather jackets covered in graffiti, and combat boots became staples, while dyed mohawks and shaved heads completed the look. As I've already mentioned, Vivienne Westwood became a huge part of the movement. Her and her then husband, Malcolm McLaren's boutique, Sex on King's Road in London, sold ripped t shirts with anarchist slogans, bondage inspired trousers, and reimagined fetish wear. Polarizing bands like the Sex Pistols and The Clash used their songs to criticize basically everything from class inequality to the establishment and even the monarchy. And similarly to the DIY element in fashion, many punk bands self produced their albums, which led to a raw and more unpolished sound. Concerts were notoriously wild, with mosh pits, stage diving, and a general sense of chaos being the norm. As a result, members of the subculture were labeled as dangerous misfits by the establishment and also by the media. By the early 1980s, punk in the UK began to fragment into different subcultures such as post-punk, new wave, and hardcore, and Vivienne Westwood's designs evolved from provocative rebellion into high fashion and have been a sensation pretty much ever since. Though punk was initially seen as a fleeting fad that posed a threat to British values, it ultimately reshaped those same values and left a permanent mark on society. So, as we can see throughout history, there's always been and probably always will be a pattern of generational conflict. The coming of age generation is full of hope and willpower to break free from the rigid traditions of their parents, while the older generation pretty much just blames the youth for their disrespectful behavior, which, if you think about it, somehow seems to be ingrained into us. I mean, as much as we don't want to admit it, the cycle will probably continue, and sometime down the line, we will be the older generation blaming the youth for challenging our worldview. But let's quickly recap the subculture pattern to see what we can expect from the future. Number one, out of dissatisfaction with the world, be it political unrest, the economy, or whatever else, the youth culture emerges as a form of rebellion, optimistic to change the world. Number two, using fashion, music, and ideologies, members of the subculture set themselves apart from the mainstream and thus create a conflict between older generations and them. Number three, over time, elements of the subculture become commodified, absorbed into the mainstream, and kind of lose their radical edge. Number four, as members grow older, the subculture evolves or fades, but its core ideals often have a lasting impact on society. Okay, now that we have a bit of an understanding about how and why subcultures come to be, it's time to look at our current era and pose the question, are we on the brink of a new counterculture? Let's explore. I want to start this section off by saying this. I am in no way a political expert, nor am I trying or claiming to be one. Like everyone else, I'm trying to make sense of the world around me, and especially in times like these, I think it's important to pay close attention to what's happening and to do the research, which is something I will continue to do. That being said, let's talk about why the current state of the world leaves us with a good condition for new countercultures to emerge. I think it's really no secret that today's world feels more divided than ever before. Political unrest, economic inequality, and our human rights being at risk have created um, an atmosphere of unease within our society. And if you paid attention to the previous part, which I hope you did, you'll know by now that historically this is the time where subcultures thrive. For a while now, far right ideologies have been on the rise all over the globe. Donald Trump's second presidency being one of the flashiest examples there is. But even in countless European countries, Germany unfortunately included, a concerning shift has been happening lately. According to a Pew Research Center study, far-right political parties gained seats in over half European parliaments between 2015 and 2020, and in the years since that, it's honestly just gotten so much worse. It's hard to ignore the parallels between today's world, especially but not only limited to the US, and pre World War II Germany. Rising nationalism, book bans targeting marginalized voices, mass deportations, and just all in all, blatant propaganda. And what makes all of this even harder is the fact that essentially we just feel completely powerless in the situation. As someone from Germany, I can't help but worry about the political climate in my own country. The rise of the AfD, which is essentially a far right party that now polls as Germany's second most popular one, is really concerning considering our past. And to be honest, right now the most popular party isn't even that much better. I think I speak for many Germans when I say that these upcoming elections by the end of February are really scary because honestly, in all of my lifetime, I've never seen my country be in this much of a political divide and just blatant hatred. It's an unfortunate reminder of how fragile our democracy can be. But on the other hand, I'm also really proud to see so many young Germans attending these huge protests, which are happening all over the country right now, and really fighting for our future. Seeing that our generation isn't afraid to stand up gives me hope not only for Germany, but honestly also for the entire world. Additionally, we're also seeing the unprecedented influence of billionaires on global politics right now. Not only is this a dangerous trend considering their financial benefit of it all and their missing understanding of the average person's struggles, but many of these men are also the CEOs of some of our major social media platforms, and that gives them the power to essentially shape the way we consume information and form our opinions. And honestly, I don't want to talk in detail about Elon Musk because I think by now we all know what kind of person he is. But the way he's trying to insert himself in the politics and ongoing elections of multiple different countries really proves of his messiah complex, I think, and it really frustrates me. To bring it back to German politics, I don't know, maybe you've seen it, but at a recent AfD rally, which remember is the far right party, Elon Musk just randomly appeared on a screen and basically endorsed their racist behavior in the most like 1984 way possible. And I really don't care if he's the richest guy on the planet. I think deep down he's just an insecure loser who wants power and attention. And yeah, I think he knows that. And and that's why he's acting like that. I really don't know. But yeah, all I'm saying is, where is Luigi when we need him? Which brings us to the man, the legend himself, Mr. Luigi Mangione. At this point, we have literally no clue if Luigi even did what he was accused of, but I think what we know for sure is that it led to millions of people resonating and basically just becoming aware of the bigger issues at hand. Both the corruption within the American healthcare system, which his alleged actions have brought to light, as well as the way the police and feds have handled his arrest and also the upcoming trial, have sparked discussions about wealth inequality and the need for systemic change in our system. And much like the economic struggles that kind of resulted in the punk movement, Gen Z is currently also dealing with a lot of financial instability due to the global wealth gap. In fact, Oxfam's 2023 report shows that the richest 1% owns more than twice the wealth of the remaining 99%, which is just completely insane. Combine that with skyrocketing rent, student debt, and underpaid wages, and it's clear why so many young people feel locked out of traditional systems of success right now. The climate crisis adds yet another issue to it all. A global survey in The Lancet found that 59% of young people feel very worried about climate change. Nearly half of those said it negatively impacts their everyday life. With extreme weather and an increase of natural disasters, we simply cannot deny that we're in like a huge crisis right now. To conclude, I think it's safe to say that the conditions for new subcultures are definitely given, but I think now the question remains, is our generation equipped to really go there? Every generation has its own unique challenges, and for Gen Z and soon also Gen Alpha, those challenges are extremely complex due to the digital age we grew up in. So, to understand whether subcultures are still possible right now, we kind of need to look at the defining traits of the youth of the present day. The majority of Gen Z was pretty much born into the internet. Therefore, connectivity wasn't really a luxury, but rather just a given. Google, YouTube, and later on even social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat were a big part of our upbringing, which had to have left a lasting impact on our development. I mean, as an quote unquote older Gen Z that was born in 99, I definitely do remember a time before the internet, but I think I would also be lying if I said it didn't shape me from a very young age on, because I think I was around like maybe 10 or 11 when I got introduced to my first means of social media. So it was still a really big part of my childhood and upbringing. Which, side note, I don't even know if these platforms were international or just German. I mean, I was using ICQ as a child. I think maybe even in elementary school, actually. I don't know. But yeah, it was this platform where you could chat with people and play games. I don't know if anyone else remembers it. And the second one is definitely only German. The second one was called SchülerVZ, so basically student VZ. I don't even know what the VZ stands for, to be honest. Um, and I was definitely also video chatting with strangers on Omegle. So, yeah, again, it must have had an impact on our development because looking back, that was actually a bit insane. Add to that the fact that before even coming fully of age, many members of Gen Z already witnessed some of the biggest crises in modern history, such as the threat of climate change, constant reporting on violent tragedies such as countless school shootings, and who could forget a global pandemic. I mean, obviously, experiencing all that worry at such a young age is going to have a lasting impact on us. Therefore, it's really no surprise that mental health awareness is our generation's most defining trait. But it also comes at a cost because constant connectivity, social media comparison, and a fear for the future have created what psychologists are calling an anxious generation. A 2023 APA study found that over 90% of Gen Z adults have reported experiencing stress about societal issues. This is most noticeable by our generation's political engagement from such a young age. I mean, movements like Fridays for Future, Free Palestine, and Black Lives Matter weren't just supported by Gen Z, a lot of them were actually led by them, as is the case with Greta Thunberg, who started her environmental activism at just 15 years old. This combination of hyper awareness, anxiety, and political engagement makes Gen Z unique, but it also raises the question, how could these factors stand in our way? Now, let's talk about Gen Z's pop culture influences, because I've seen this notion come up on my TikTok when talking about the current political climate and our desire for a revolution, but I thought it was a really interesting point, so I'm gonna include it here as well. Basically, people were making the argument that during our adolescence, young adult dystopian media was basically the most popular genre amongst movies and books. Franchises like The Hunger Games, Divergent, and The Maze Runner, which depicted young people standing up against oppressive systems, fighting for survival, and building new societies, were insanely successful at the time. The theory is that consuming that kind of media in our formative years might have shaped our worldview and made us more aware of social injustice in the world. And to be honest, I definitely think there is some truth to that because looking back, dystopian literature such as 1984 and Brave New World definitely serve as a way to critique power systems and warn against authoritarian structures. Therefore, it doesn't really come as a surprise that watching The Hunger Games at like 12 years old might have influenced how we view the government, corporate control, and societal resistance today. Because of that, many people online are joking about how Gen Z was basically trained for rebellion, but considering the current state of the world, I'm actually not too mad about it. But in response to those same semi hopeful, semi joking TikToks, you also get just as many or even more people complaining about how Gen Z is romanticizing the revolution and essentially just living out their hero fantasies. And this sentiment goes hand in hand with a broader critique that due to social media, activism these days oftentimes becomes performative. And I might be in the minority here, but I think writing this entire opera off as just one big performance is a bit unfair, to be honest, because while I do agree that our desire for public perception definitely plays a part in it, in the end, this will for change is definitely engraved in all of us. And especially now that the world has come to such a bad place, I think we just reached a point that we can't ignore any longer. Plus, I'd much prefer people who openly speak out and overdo it to those who really don't do anything and just belittle others for it. Oh, and also, no hate to the girl of the TikTok earlier, but I think it comes to show that we are kind of putting our blame on the wrong people right now because, like, let's be real, we shouldn't focus on the people that use code words or write stuff on money or paper or whatever it was on TikTok. But instead, we should put our frustration on the CEOs and billionaires and politicians who are the reason for it and who can change it. That being said, though, the internet is really a peculiar place because On the one hand, it makes information so much more accessible, it connects people from all over the world, and it also holds the power to make a movement or a trend go viral basically overnight. But on the other hand, due to the algorithmic nature of social media, everything just automatically becomes an aesthetic or a core, which leaves us with loads of micro movements and trends that essentially just fade as quickly as they appeared in the first place. For example, if we're staying on the topic of clothes, like 20 to 30 years ago, a fashion trend might have taken years to slowly develop, gaining traction on runways and in fashion magazines before slowly being commercialized and then fading out of fashion again. Today, because of the internet and fast fashion's ability to instantly copy and mass produce styles, trends can explode out of nowhere and disappear basically in the matter of months or even just weeks. And I think the hype around certain news topics and also movements kind of follows a similar pattern of a rapid rise and decline again. To conclude this part of the video, I think it's undeniable that social media has kind of replaced physical spaces as the main way that people connect with each other and form communities. But it also leaves us with one big question. Does this shift make it easier for subcultures to emerge, or does the internet's fast pace actually hinder movements and trends from making a lasting impact? Now, to kind of compare the past and the present, we're going to look at some parallels, what's missing right now, and also what the future of subcultures might look like. We've already talked in detail about the current state of the world, so to make it short, theoretically, the external circumstances that lead to the creation of new countercultures are very much still given today. Just like in any of the five subcultures we looked at before, young people today show similar signs of feeling unhappy with where we're at right now. Not only that, but this drive and desire to challenge traditions and basically change the world seems to be ingrained in every new generation, Gen Z included. It might just manifest in different ways for us. But if we're looking at what might be missing, despite having the why for new subcultures, the how has drastically changed in the meantime, which brings us to the first big difference between back then and now, which is the loss of physical spaces. As we can see from various subcultures in the past, before the digital age, different groups used to form in specific countries or even cities because proximity played a crucial role in shaping a shared identity. Places such as music venues, underground clubs, and even local hangouts allowed countercultures to develop organically. I don't know if this is a stretch, but I guess in a way, different social media bubbles could kind of replace those original physical spaces as the building ground for new subcultures to form. However, this could in turn also mean that most of the key elements that define a subculture, for example, rebellion and activism, are going to be happening more online instead of through in person gatherings like we're used to seeing them historically. Another issue that comes with the rise of the internet is our constant exposure to globalized culture, which basically makes it more difficult to create something entirely new because, in a way, everything just feels like a copy or a rebrand of something that already exists. However, I actually don't see this critique as that big of a problem because, looking back in a way, every counterculture took inspiration from something that came before them. I mean, just looking at our examples from before, the mods were really inspired by the polished European look, and the hippies drew influences from Eastern traditions. So it's not so much about proper new inventions, but rather about taking something unconventional that stands in contrast to the status quo and kind of making it one's own. If anything, the challenge today isn't really a lack of originality. It's more so about figuring out how to create a distinct identity in a world where everything seems to be ever evolving. In a way, subcultures tend to emerge as a fusion of old and new, and I think it's really difficult to really predict what the next counterculture might look like, just because there's simply so much going on at once in the world right now that I don't even know which issue to address first. That being said, I think we're already seeing glimpses of new subcultures forming right now through growing activism, especially in environmentalism movements and anti capitalist sentiments. One familiar way in which we're already seeing this play out is on college campuses, both in the US but also globally. Recently, universities all over the world became the ground for mass protests advocating for Palestine, which honestly was strikingly similar to the hippie movement of the 1960s and the Vietnam War. I mean, I guess that goes to show that physical spaces aren't completely gone from new forming subcultures after all, but I think it's also fair to say that without the internet and people's ability to advocate and connect online, those big reactions probably wouldn't have happened in the same way. In the near future, I could maybe see a rise in countercultures that embrace big shifts in a lifestyle. For example, going completely offline or just creating self sufficient communities in response to our current economic state. In terms of fashion trends and aesthetics, I'm still a bit clueless though, just because I feel like with so many revivals over the past few years, we've pretty much exhausted every style from the past like 2 decades or so. So, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty excited to see what our generation is going to draw inspiration from next. To conclude this section, I suppose while today's world makes it harder for subcultures to take root in the traditional sense, that doesn't mean that rebellion is dead per se. It just means that we might need to redefine what a counterculture looks like in the digital age. And that brings us to the end of the video. I'd love to hear your opinion on the matter. Do you think that subcultures can still form and grow in the digital age? And if so, what might they look like in the future? Definitely let me know in the comments. Yeah, thank you for watching and see you soon.